In 1947, deep within the mountain foothills of Isulan, Sultan Kudarat, Nirvan ruled over a tribe that had protected their ancestral lands for 6 generations. Their territory stretched across vast expanses of untamed wilderness, and every man born into the tribe was raised as a warrior, masters of a deadly combat art that resembled a dance of death itself. The tribe operated under 2 sacred laws: never harm nature without purpose, and never take wild animals unnecessarily. Those who violated these commandments faced swift and brutal justice. Few outsiders dared enter their domain, but among the rare exceptions was Omar, a farmer from the lowlands who had earned their trust through 7 years of respectful hunting expeditions. Omar brought gifts from the outside world, tools, food, stories, and had become the only outsider Nirvan considered a true friend. The tribal leader looked forward to these visits, unaware that his trust would soon become the catalyst for unthinkable horror. The betrayal began on an afternoon when Omar arrived outside his usual schedule, his face etched with desperate urgency. He requested privacy, leading Nirvan into the shadows of his dwelling, where the afternoon light seemed to die before reaching the walls. "My family has been taken," Omar whispered, his hands trembling as he described the debt collectors who had seized his wife and children. They're powerful men with connections to rebels and officials alike. "I can't fight them alone, but with your help." Nirvan felt the weight of friendship pressing against his better judgment. Every instinct screamed warnings, but compassion clouded his warrior's clarity. Against his deepest convictions, he agreed to help, not through violence, but through negotiation. "I'll speak with them," Nirvan promised, sealing both their fates. "We'll find a peaceful solution." The journey to Omar's village should have been routine, but an oppressive atmosphere hung over the landscape like smoke from a funeral pyre. Nirvan brought 2 of his sons, seasoned warriors in their own right, while Omar provided sparse details about their adversaries, his answers growing more evasive with each question. When they arrived at Omar's home, armed men waited like vultures around carrion. Their leader, a scarred man with cold eyes, dragged Omar's wife forward by her hair, while his children cowered in the shadows. The sight ignited rage in Nirvan's chest, but he forced himself to remain calm. The confrontation that followed lasted only seconds. "So the savage brought friends," the leader sneered, his weapon already drawn. "Are you going to pay his debts? Or should I add your corpses to his collection?" Before Nirvan could respond, gunfire erupted. His 2 sons dropped to the ground, their blood pooling in the dirt as their father watched in helpless shock. Omar's family followed moments later, executed with casual indifference, while their neighbor looked on without a trace of surprise. The betrayal hit Nirvan like a physical blow. Omar had orchestrated everything: the debt story, the desperate plea for help, the ambush. His oldest friend had sold him and his children for whatever blood money these killers offered. As bullets whistled past his head, Nirvan's warrior instincts finally overwhelmed his grief. He fled into the jungle, using every skill learned over decades of mountain warfare to evade the hunters now pursuing him. Behind him, he heard Omar's screams as his usefulness expired along with his breath. The 5 men who pursued Nirvan through the dense jungle moved with urban arrogance, unprepared for the predator they were hunting. Their leader had made a fatal error, believing that modern weapons could substitute for generations of wilderness wisdom. Nirvan moved through the foliage like a ghost, selecting his first target with calculated precision. When the rearmost pursuer passed beneath his perch, the tribal chief dropped silently from above. His makeshift wooden spears found their mark in the man's throat, severing arteries and windpipe in one fluid motion that painted the jungle floor crimson. The kill awakened something primal within him. As he stalked the remaining 4 hunters, Nirvan felt his humanity slipping away like water through cupped hands. Each death became more savage, more personal, more satisfying. By the time he finished with the last screaming victim, his hands were stained with gore and his heart had turned to ice. But revenge against foot soldiers could never be enough. The real enemy, the man who had ordered his son's execution, remained untouched, protected by wealth and influence that conventional justice could never reach. Nirvan returned to his village with murder burning in his soul, seeking the one person who might grant him the power to achieve true vengeance. In the deepest shadows of the tribal lands lived an ancient practitioner of forbidden arts, a keeper of knowledge that most men feared to even acknowledge. The old man's dwelling reeked of decay and dark offerings. Candles flickered against impossible drafts, while shadows writhed independently of their sources. The elder sat hunched over a black tome, his lips moving in silent incantations that made the very air taste of copper and sulfur. "I hear your heart screaming for blood," the sorcerer said without looking up. "You seek power to claim the vengeance that honorable methods cannot provide. But such gifts demand payment in kind. Are you prepared to surrender everything you are for the chance to destroy your enemies?" Without hesitation, Nirvan agreed to pay whatever price darkness demanded. He transferred leadership of his tribe to his wife, knowing he would never return to claim it. The ritual that followed would transform him into something that could never again walk among the living. The sorcerer's chants filled the night with promises of supernatural strength, inhuman endurance, and the ability to tear his enemies apart with his bare hands. But the power would only fully manifest after death and resurrection. As dawn approached, Nirvan felt compelled to journey deep into the mountains, far from his people. The transformation had already begun, and he could sense darkness taking root in his soul, like poison spreading through his veins. By 10 o'clock that night, his human body finally surrendered to the curse. On a lonely mountaintop, Nirvan collapsed as his heart stopped beating and his lungs drew their final breath. His spirit departed for what felt like an eternity of absolute nothingness. No heaven, no hell. Just void that mocked every belief he had ever held about death and salvation. When consciousness returned, Nirvan found himself buried beneath layers of earth and vegetation, his body preserved by unnatural forces, while roots and vines had grown through his flesh like a living shroud. 7 years had passed in what felt like moments, and the world he awakened to had moved on without him. The revelation that 7 years had vanished like smoke left Nirvan reeling. His human mind struggled to comprehend the passage of time, while his transformed body hummed with supernatural energy that felt both intoxicating and revolting. When he reached the nearest town, locals treated him like a madman, unable to believe his claims about the missing years. But gradually, he began to piece together fragments of a larger horror. His tribe had gained a reputation for savage attacks on neighboring settlements, becoming the very monsters that legends warned against. The news drove him toward his ancestral home with growing dread. Something had gone catastrophically wrong during his absence, twisting his people into the kind of creatures they had once fought against. The tribal grounds that greeted him were a mockery of their former glory. Broken fences surrounded a compound that reeked of blood and decay. When the gates opened, familiar faces emerged, wearing chains around their necks like cattle. their bodies bearing fresh wounds that spoke of recent torture. But it was the sight of their captors that truly broke Nirvan's reconstructed heart. The man who had murdered his sons now strutted through the tribal grounds like a conquering emperor, while Nirvan's wife and surviving child crawled on hands and knees like animals, broken by years of unspeakable abuse. The sorcerer's trap had been masterful in its cruelty. While Nirvan lay dead, the old man had sought his own revenge against those who killed his grandson. Only Nirvan's wife and child had been spared the full transformation, left as witnesses to their people's corruption and guardians of the truth about what had happened. The sight of his family's suffering unleashed the full fury of Nirvan's supernatural rebirth. He tore through the compound like a hurricane of vengeance, his enhanced strength allowing him to crush skulls with his bare hands and tear spines from living bodies. The leader who had destroyed his old life died slowly, his neck snapping with a sound like breaking timber before Nirvan's claws opened his belly and scattered his entrails across the ground. But even as he savored the taste of long-delayed justice, a more horrible truth emerged. His transformed tribespeople continued attacking him, their humanity so thoroughly corrupted that death had become the only mercy he could offer them. His wife's screams echoed across the blood-soaked compound as she begged him to understand. Their friends and family were lost forever, twisted by dark magic into creatures that existed only to feed and kill. The only choice remaining was to end their suffering with the same hands that had once protected them. The massacre that followed would haunt Nirvan for the rest of his extended existence. Each death was both an act of love and an unforgivable sin, mercy and murder intertwined, until he could no longer distinguish between salvation and damnation. When the killing finally ended, Nirvan burned the compound to ash, giving his enemies' remains to the flames while burying his people with the honor they deserved. But the smoke that rose from that pyre carried more than the scent of destruction. It marked the birth of something that was no longer entirely human. Years passed as Nirvan learned to navigate his new existence, using his supernatural abilities to hunt the creatures of darkness that threatened innocent people. The folk healer, traditional healers and monster hunters began to speak of a mysterious protector who appeared when evil gathered its strength. They called him the tribal chief of darkness, a title that acknowledged both his noble intentions and the terrible power that made them possible. But in the deepest hours of night, when even supernatural strength could not silence the memories of what he had become, Nirvan wondered if the curse that saved him from his enemies had ultimately transformed him into the very thing he had once sworn to destroy. After all, what difference existed between a monster that killed for hunger and one that killed for justice, when both left the same trail of blood and broken lives in their wake?